welcome to all of you joining with us. We are bringing to you this special broadcast from the Media Centre of the Parliament of Sri Lanka. To start with, I would like to share one of my favorite quotes which says, "Every experience shared is a priceless collector's item as well as a valuable source of knowledge. And a man, in order to attain such knowledge, needs the help of someone who possesses it." And that is why today we have a very special guest sharing his experience and knowledge with us specifically on the parliamentary committee system. And he is none other than Honourable Lord Malcolm Grey Bruce, representing the House of Lords of the Parliament of the United Kingdom. Having 32 years of experience at the House of Commons and 4.5 years of experience at the House of Lords, Lord Malcolm was a Member of Parliament for Gordon from 1983 to 2015, and he was the former Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats. He has also served on many committees, notably covering economic affairs, national security, energy and environment, and was also the chair of the House of Commons International Development Select Committee from 2005 to 2015. Lord Malcolm is also a knight. He was knighted for his public and political service, and it brings me great honour in welcoming Lord Malcolm for today's program. Aibon, and welcome Lord Malcolm for today's program. As we speak of the parliamentary committee system, we know that these committees play an important role in terms of scrutinizing legislation and overlooking the functions of the government. So given your experience, I would like to know, how does these committees function in the UK and how has it evolved over the years?
Well, I think it's interesting because people assume that the United Kingdom Parliament is an ancient parliament and must have had established procedures that go back a long way, but actually our committee system is fairly new. The select committees were only established 40 years ago, and they've developed really in the last 10 or 15 years in quite strong ways. Every government department has a committee attached to it, which is to hold it to account to Parliament. The committees are small, like 11 members. I think what has changed just in the last few years is whereas they used to be appointed by the business managers, in other words, the party bosses, if you like, and they were therefore either a vehicle for reward or punishment, they're now elected by the House. So the chairs are elected by the whole House and the members are elected by their respective parties. And that's given them a lot more authority, a lot more status, and actually meant that MPs value being both on a committee and certainly being a chair of a committee. I have to say, incidentally, the chairs get paid, but that isn't actually an essential vehicle. It's just worth recording because there's obviously a reward. It also gives a sort of alternative career to people who may not become ministers or opposition officials, but they can become you can develop a parliamentary career. So that's how they've evolved. What do? The first thing is that the committees themselves, they decide their own business. So they will decide which aspect of their department's policy they want to look at. It may be future plans, it may be how existing policies are working, it may be whether there's a gap that they need to fill. And there's 2 or 3 important things I would suggest that make the committees effective or not if they don't follow them. One is they need to work as a team. You've got government members, you've got opposition members, but they should really agree on what they're going to do, how they're going to go about it, and then follow the evidence. So committees will develop really good relationships with all the stakeholders in their area, who will be regular contributors, give evidence, give advice, give support. Got to avoid being captured, but nevertheless they're a valuable resource. And then when they've completed their inquiry, the important thing is to come up with a report that follows the evidence and carries the whole committee. Now that doesn't happen just like that. There has to be negotiation, it requires the government members to recognise that the evidence is suggesting the government could do better or do things differently. The opposition members also have to restrain themselves and not try to use it as a means just to beat the government. The objective is to get better policy and better delivery. And I think by following it that way and keeping the committee together, the committees have become quite effective. I mean, it's very hard to dismiss the recommendations of a committee that has produced a unanimous report across party based on evidence from people in the field. And as a result of that, I think, although the government doesn't have to accept any of the recommendations, they do have to respond to them. Following that process, quite often it does shape government policy. And it also, I think, makes Parliament look much more effective than the usual vision of argument and shouting, which is what the public see most of the time. So the committees are a bit under the counter, but to me that's the serious work of Parliament, which actually ought to be better known and better understood.
So how often do these committees meet, and how attentive are the committee members in the process of carrying out these committee meetings?
Well, obviously again it's up to the committee. Most of the committees will meet at least once a week, sometimes twice a week, maybe a formal meeting and sometimes an informal meeting. Attendance is not compulsory, although if attendance drops below a certain level, a member can be asked to leave. But bearing in mind they've competed to get elected to the committee, so they have some obligation to attend and some motivation. I would say on average, from my own experience, on an 11-member committee, you would hope to have about 8 members attending most sessions. Not the same 8, well, hopefully, but mostly. As a chair, obviously, you attend them all. I mean, I think in 10 years I only missed 3 meetings. If you have too many meetings, obviously it's a bit hard on the members, so you're going to find it harder to hold the numbers together. And obviously members have competing interests. But I think because, as I explained, we're now elected, because of the authority that committees command now, I would say that the attendance is much better than it was. It's slightly more difficult in the run-up to an election, and particularly if the government hasn't got a majority. MPs are, looking over their shoulder, and sometimes it's harder to hold the government members in the committee. Yes. So the important thing is to lead the committee, but to allow the committee to express itself as collectively, not just the chairman's view, but the whole committee's view.
Right. So Malcolm, we know that these committee secretariats provide a lot of support and assistance to its members to assure that these committee meetings are effectively and smoothly run. So can you explain what sort of support you get from these committee secretariats?
The first thing I want to put on record, the quality of the staff we have is absolutely superb, and their commitment and their dedication. I think it's very rewarding for them, mind you. So the committee have, in one sense a small staff, but I think most people in most other parliaments would be envious, I think. On average, it depends slightly on the size or importance of the committee, but we probably have about 6 or 8 staff members. So there's usually a clerk, and maybe a deputy clerk, and then 1 or 2 special advisors. In other words, quite people with expertise, either practical or academic, in that field. And then 2 or 3 sort of administrative people, or people who help with writing reports and obviously communicating with the outside and members and so on. I think it's very interesting that they provide advice and support, both in terms of the terms of reference and the, if you like, the material content, but also the procedures and so on. Keep the committee and the chair right in terms of process and procedure, and serve the whole committee. So any member of the committee should be able to ask the staff for any information or help with drafting amendments or contribution or suggesting things. And for example, I had an experience where between changing of the Parliament, I had a lot of new members on the committee. Was established as the chair, and I was explaining what we were trying to do, and I misread the committee because they thought I was telling them when I was really just trying to explain to them. And when I realised they weren't very happy, they didn't really know what was going on, I said, right, we're going to have what I called a Quaker meeting, which I think, a Quaker meeting where everybody sits in the room and nobody says anything until they feel they've got something to say, but really to say to everybody, say anything you like. and we had a half a day away, and on the back of that, people said, well, we don't know what's going on, we don't understand what's happening, we don't understand what our role is. And it enabled me and them and the staff to engage together so that they understand it was their committee, their resource, and they had every right to help shape it. The practical fact is, as chair, you're the one who does all the preparation, all the work, reads all the papers. So inevitably the chair is usually more experienced and more informed, but that doesn't mean the chair has the right to impose, and I think that's really important. So that cleared the air, and that worked. And I think the net result of that is it made the committee more effective, because every member knew they could tap the whole resource of the committee and help to shape an inquiry, make suggestions as to who we should take evidence from and what we might want to say, so that when you come to the end of the process of producing a report, the committee is already half together, and then obviously you have the process of negotiating the final words.
Right. So we know that these committee members, they represent different political ideologies and parties. Yeah. But when you're in a committee, it's important for you to be apolitical.
Yes.
So how do members engage in terms of taking an objective approach, and how challenging has it been?
Well, I mean, that's actually a really fundamentally important question. And I should just stress that for the last 5 years as chair of the International Committee, there were 11 members. I was the only Liberal Democrat member, and I was the chair. I had 5 Conservatives and 5 Labour members. So clearly I could not impose a party political will even if I'd wanted to. But my point was that nor should the others. So I think the basic rule is to leave not your principles, but leave your party allegiances outside the door and look at the evidence. And certainly some committees inevitably are going to be more political than others, but even so the objective should be let's look at the facts, let's look at the information available, let's try to make our recommendations based that, influenced by all means by our political views, but not predetermined by them. And it's not our job to impose a political outcome against the evidence. So my entreaty was always try to leave your political line, if you like, outside the door, and follow the evidence as objectively as you can, and recognise that if we're going to produce a report that will be listened to, we all have to agree, which doesn't mean without debate or without argument. We have to come to an agreed position following the evidence. And my experience is that's when a report is effective. Think about it. You're the minister in any given department, health, education, international development, foreign affairs, or what have you, and a committee has selected a topic, taken evidence, produced a report, and the report lands on your desk as a recommendation from a committee which has unanimous support from members of all the parties on the committee, which is reflective of evidence from experts and practitioners in the field about an issue which is obviously relevant and topical, and there's a whole series of recommendations. I think it would be a very bold or foolhardy minister who would just dismiss that out of hand. I think a good minister will recognise that this is a piece of work that they should take notice of. Now, they may choose not to implement any of the recommendations, but they certainly shouldn't do it lightly or without regard to the fact that this is a serious piece of work. And it's quite different from what goes on in the legislative bill committees, which usually tend to degenerate into government versus opposition. Sure. And they're in public, and that's what the public see. If a select committee operates like that, it's wasting its time, frankly. It's not going to achieve anything.
Right. Well, Malcolm, we live in a technological era, and no doubt that technology is imperative when it comes to conducting these parliamentary committees and day-to-day activities in Parliament as well. And we are open to the public, we are talking about an open Parliament. So how do members use technology or utilize technology in terms of these committee processes?
All our committee evidence is now live broadcast on the web. So everything is available, and as a result of that, obviously it's all recorded. So any committee that's had a public evidence session, anybody can access that session, and any member of the committee can obviously clip it and send it out on their Twitter feed or their Facebook. So quite often they will say, here's me asking my question of the minister about why he or she is or isn't doing whatever. So it means the members can use it, if you like, in the way that politicians normally do, to self-promote. But nevertheless, hopefully in a way that says, this is me doing a job of work which you don't necessarily normally see to the same extent. And I've certainly noticed quite a lot of my colleagues and others doing exactly that, putting little clips out saying, here's me asking a question in a select committee about X or Y. And that, I think, helps to generate a wider understanding. So the followers of a given member will get that feed. The followers of a particular sectoral interest will probably get that or related feeds. And obviously people are able to comment and feed in, and the website will accept email contributions or just text contributions. So I would say that it's evolving all the time, but there's a pretty good interaction, and the work of the committees is getting better known, and we also evaluate all the time how effective we're being and share experiences. You know, some committees may be more successful than others. Sometimes it's the issue. So the other thing I actually think is also very important, what you mustn't do, this is just personal, but you mustn't just chase the media agenda, and I say that with all due respect to the media, but your job is to actually shape the policy and the accountability on your terms as a committee, and not to be driven, not to try and sensationalise, not to grandstand, not to try and use the committee to seek attention. It's about probing to get good information to inform good reporting. And that's a discipline that a lot of MPs find difficult. But my view is there's plenty of other opportunities to do that, not in the Select Committee. In the Select Committee, we work together and we do it to try and show Parliament, if you like, doing that sort of serious day-to-day, perhaps to some people dull, but in many ways more important work on really helping to shape policy and delivery in ways that I think the public would appreciate, and when they see that, possibly value a little bit more than the usual shouting match.
Right. Since we were talking about how information is being shared and about technology, social media is a very strong platform, and it's now a global trend. So in terms of the Parliament as an institution, and in terms of the committees, which function as a subsidiary of the Parliament, how does it as an institution use social media platforms to cater?
So we've got to recognise there's a lot of filth out there, really nasty stuff. On the other hand, there's a huge opportunity to reach people. So obviously Parliament has to ensure that what it's doing is done responsibly and also policed effectively, so that it's not used for trolling. So if, you know, say a woman MP puts a clip on them asking a question and it then attracts a lot of offensive comment, that needs to be tackled very quickly. In the sort of rather fraught scenario we've had in British politics in the last year, I mean, we've had real problems with, I mean, women MPs in particular requiring police protection, being chased down the street, harassed, and quite, you know, and I'm afraid social media has driven that. So that's not to denigrate social media. It's an incredible platform, a force for good, but also a force for evil. And Parliament is obviously trying to manage it, the whole sphere, but on its own terms, it's got to try and ensure that social media, in terms of promoting the work of Parliament, is contained within what I would call the dull environment of day-to-day work, and does not in any way fuel that more extreme response, but absolutely essential, obviously, to the day-to-day work.
So during committees, I think there are certain discussions which are sensitive or regarded as classified. So in terms of such sensitive information, perhaps regarding national security or terrorism, how does these committees handle situations as such?
They are very sensitive, and I wouldn't say we've got it perfectly right. We've probably got 3 committees in different forms that cover that area. So we have the Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy, we have the Intelligence and Security Committee, and we have the Defence Select Committee, which is just a departmental select committee like any other. It will occasionally, the Defence Select Committee, get into sensitive areas, although an awful lot of time it focused on the kit and the budget and whether we have enough ships and too many bombs or this or that, which is what a lot of people who's in defence, it's the toys that they're concerned about. But it still sometimes does require confidential. The Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy was sent up specifically to provide for a public engagement on how the government assesses the threats in national security and responds to them. So it has a specific remit from government to disseminate that. Although I have to say, having been on it for a few years, I think it's found it difficult to know quite how to do that. And I'm not sure we've been that effective. But we've certainly been given insights. So we've been shown in confidence the scale of threats to national security of all kinds on a grid which shows the extremity, you know, the impact on an escalating degree of impact, and also the likelihood. So you obviously have the worst impact, the worst likelihood is the worst, and going to the other extreme. And then that enables us to have an intelligent discussion. Well, what are you doing about it? I can tell you, incidentally, without breaching any secrets, that what actually emerged from that was the biggest threat in terms of likelihood and impact was nothing to do with terrorism or enemy action, but was the likelihood of a serious volcanic eruption in Iceland, creating a cloud that would completely destroy our cyber systems for indefinite period of time, which would be life-threatening. So, you know, the public need to know that and how the reaction is. I was a member of that committee. I wasn't a member and haven't been a member of the Intelligence and Security Committee, but obviously I've had colleagues who have been, and I've also seen the work of that committee. That is probably the most sensitive committee. However, the way that's dealt with is that all the members of that committee are Privy Councillors. Now, I don't know whether you have that equivalent here, but the Privy Councillors have all signed an oath to the Queen to uphold state secrets and the national interest and all that kind of thing. So they can be briefed on an understanding that they will not breach any security or leak any information. And that's important because although they can take evidence in public where it's appropriate, they also take evidence in private, and they will publish reports which obviously won't disclose secret information, but will testify to the fact that they've had this information and they've evaluated it and can possibly give reassurance or indicate the questions that have been asked. And it's fair to say that there have been no leaks from that committee, nor should there have been. And, you know, they've been angry because, for example, they've produced reports which have been highly critical, which the government, and the other safeguard is their reports are only published at the discretion of government. Other committees publish their own reports. And the last report they produced, which was on Russian interference in the UK, has not been published because the government haven't signed it off. It's contentious, people know that to be the case, but we don't know what's in the report. So the sensitivities are there, but the government has its final safeguard. And nevertheless, I think the net result of that is the public can be reassured that senior MPs have access to the top people in security and the information that they're acting on, and have been able to question and evaluate that. And I think that gives confidence to people. I mean, people want our intelligence to work. They want good security. We've had cyber attacks. We have threats. So it isn't as if there isn't public support, but there's also public concern when it's all done in secret that they're not misusing their powers. So I think having a committee like that, even with all the sensitivities, is really valuable and I think important to government. I personally think the government are wrong to be as hesitant as they are, but equally, imperfect as the system is, it's there, it functions, it works. The committee doesn't meet often enough, it doesn't report often enough, but it does meet and it does report and it does take evidence. So the answer is it's an imperfect system, but I think in a democratic society, the idea that we shouldn't have some degree of parliamentary engagement with security and intelligence, I think is disturbing. I think people will need to know that, and people understand the importance for state secrecy. That I don't think that's really the issue. They just want to be sure that there's an independent voice of the people looking at it, not just government and the officials themselves.
Right. So Lord Malcolm, as my final question, 37 odd years of
very odd years.
Yes, of experience. I'm sure it must have been a very bumpy ride as well, and you must have had your ups and downs. But in terms of committees, what challenges do you see when it comes to committees, and what measures have the UK Parliament taken in order to overcome it? And also I would like to know, I know it has been a very short time you have been with us, but with what you've gathered, what is the message that you wish to share?
Well, you know, Churchill said democracy is a very poor system of government, but it's better than all the others, which are worse. It's very imperfect. So I'm a parliamentarian. I suppose I'm a champion of parliaments. Parliaments, I think, have to fight all the time for their rights. Don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that all governments are naturally tending to be autocratic or want to dismiss Parliament. But Parliament is an irritant if you're in government. Parliament is a nuisance. Parliament asks awkward questions. And Parliament needs to be independent and needs to have the authority. I think there's a responsibility for parliamentarians on the government side, and governments change after all, not to be totally subservient to the interests of government and understand there's wider interest. That's asking a lot, but I think it's important. And for Parliament to be adequately resourced to do its job and to actually set its own rules as to how it does its job. So one of the things I have picked up, for example, is possibly a tendency under the system to overload committees with sort of statutory obligations for them to assess things, which doesn't give them time to make their own assessment and own inquiries. And I think it's really important that Parliament should set its own priorities as to how it holds the government to account. Of course the government needs a Parliament, it needs to get its legislation through, and it's not Parliament's job to frustrate it, but it is its job to hold it properly to account, to use evidence, to try and shape policy. And that requires constant vigilance and campaigning, and an obligation, in my view, and all members of Parliament, never to forget. You're put there by the people to hold the executive, the government officials to account. It doesn't mean they're your enemy or you're their enemy, but it does mean there has to be a difference and a proper creative tension, and that's what good Parliament should do. And it's a never-ending battle to get the balance right. And Parliaments get it wrong and governments get it wrong, and we just have to keep working at it forever.
Right. So it has been a very enlightening and an insightful session, and we are grateful and thankful for your time with us, Honourable Lord Malcolm Grey-Bruce. Thank you for bestowing us with your experience and knowledge. So all good things must come to an end. So with that note, we mark the end for today's program. Thank you for tuning in with us. Have a nice day.